Anyway, the key distinction that's introduced in Republic 3 and then brought back in Republic 10 doesn't concern the content of poetry, but the form. And there's a distinction made between diegesis and mimesis, between narration and imitation. Narration and imitation. And this can be a fairly intricate argument, but I won't go into the intricacy of it. Let me just put it broadly, as it were. Narration is the description of events in one's own person. Right? You know, I arrived in Sussex and I met someone and then I went to bed or whatever. So it's first-person narrative. Mimesis is a narration that proceeds by imitation, not by speaking in one's own voice, but by speaking in the voice of another. And that's where the problem arises, right? Mimicry. So narration is admissible in a just city, a philosophical city, but some mimesis should not be admitted because the guardians might seek to imitate bad characters, and imitating bad characters become bad. The argument is as crude as that. And then the question becomes immediately, this is around 393 Republic, the question immediately becomes whether tragedy and comedy should be admitted into the just city. Right? Having set up this distinction, Socrates introduces straight away the argument about tragedy. And the conclusion of the argument is that tragedy is pure mimesis, is pure imitation, where people are pretending to be someone else. The two other genres, lyric and epic. In lyric, I wandered lonely as a cloud. I speak in a form of narration, although that might be a rather emotive narration. Pindar, Pindaric odes. In epic, there's a mixture of narration and imitation. So in epic, you know, goddess sing me of the wrath of Achilles and blah blah blah. I'm sung by the god, but it's the bard singing, and then there'll be movements into forms of imitation, and you'll pull back into narration. That's okay, as long as it's imitation of the good. But pure mimesis is the problem. And again, I'm not making this up. If you've looked at Republic, you'll see that I'm not. But it gets quite strange in Book 3. The economy of mimesis is a moral economy. Guardians can imitate the good as long as they do it in their own person, but they should not imitate the bad. And then he says things, Socrates says, they must not mimic women, they must not mimic slaves, cowards, or criminals, and the guardian cannot be in any circumstance that most abysmal of all creatures, the actor. Right? Hippocrates in Greek. Right? Hypocrite. There's no place in philosophy for the actor. Rousseau rehearses these exact same arguments, you know, in the letter to d'Alembert in 1758. The actor is lived through by mimesis. They should not imitate blacksmiths, craftsmen, or men rowing triremes, ships. They should not imitate the neighing of horses, the bellowing of bulls, or the roaring of the sea and thunder, Socrates says. I'm not making this up. Or the noise of axles and wheels is also prohibited. Trumpets, pipes, and the barking of dogs. Or the imitation of the sheep on the mountain. These are all things that a guardian should not do. Then we get this extraordinary, at the end of Book 3, he says, the guardian has to refuse to be the double man. The double man. This is very important. The philosopher must refuse to be the double man. Socrates says, 397e, in our regime, each man does one thing. One man, one job. One woman, like one man, one job. Tragedy is about doubleness throughout. It's where the arguments are going to try and develop towards the end. It's also the burden of the argument in relationship to Judith's stuff on Nietzsche. One of the things that's revealed in tragedy is the essential doubleness of what it is to be. The doubleness of character. Anyway, for Socrates, and this is, again, it's radical in the Athenian context. What is being excluded by Socrates is the idea that a human being can perform a multiplicity of roles. Right? If you read Santa Hannah Arendt of the New School, may Lord praise her, we have to say that at the New School. Hannah Arendt. If you read Santa Hannah, you'll find in the human condition one of the things that she celebrates in Athens, and Arendt is entirely subject to a whole series of romantic presuppositions about the Greeks, which we could go into. What she likes about the pre-Platonic, let's say, political sphere is the affirmation of a multiplicity of roles. You become this, you become that, the other. Socrates is clear. It's one person does one thing. Right? A soldier is a soldier, an artisan is an artisan, a philosopher is a philosopher, a guardian is a guardian. And on that basis, on the basis that the tragic poet allows a multiplicity of roles, allows confusion about one's identity, they have to be excluded from the just city. That's the end of Book 3. And then the argument is taken up again in Book 10.
Is this based around the idea of multiplicity, the idea for Alcibiades, and the ruler understanding maybe what a blacksmith can do, what, on and on and on?
Well, there's this other side to Socrates, which is that, the story of he went around asking people whether they know anything, and who knows, and the only person that knew something was the artisan, the blacksmith. Right? So there's this idealization of the artisanal in Socrates. So in a sense, the carpenter makes beds or chairs, and they're good because the carpenter has the form of the chair or the bed in mind, and then produces an object. We can organise knowledge on that basis for Socrates. So if you like, there's a kind of imitation of the craftsman at the core of Socrates. A refusal of the poet and affirmation of the craftsman, which is interesting. And the images that are used for the acquisition of knowledge are always artisanal images, as we're going to see in Book 10. Right? Is that sort of what's in
Yeah, it's been years since I read Alcibiades, but I think it was about, I don't know if Socrates was saying that he would make a better ruler than the actual young man being groomed to rule. I don't know.
Alcibiades would make a better ruler, or Socrates would make a better ruler.
It seemed that Socrates was saying that he better understood the just or the multiplicity, but I don't know.
Right. Because the argument for the philosopher king is it's always interesting. I think this is one thing that I think I'm very keen on in the Republic, is that philosopher should rule because the philosopher does not want to rule. Right? There's a basic principle which only give power to those who don't want power. That's just, I think it's an interesting idea, but there's always a sort of hypocritical reluctance within that. Oh no, I'm not going to. Oh no, I'm not going to govern. No, okay, if you insist, I'll come in another 4 years. I'd rather go off to the woods. And so Socrates has always been dragged into discussion. I don't know what we discuss. Just let's look at the boys in the gymnasium. No, okay, well, let's talk about it. And Alcibiades, of course, was the golden youth who was precisely became the tyrant and the enemy of democracy. There's a whole history.
So, does the philosopher king become a double man with a
No.
double role?
Oh, that's interesting. The philosopher king is, in a sense, the philosopher king can rule because they have no interest in ruling. They know how to rule and they know what the just is. They'd rather do philosophy, but they're compelled to rule because that's their obligation.
Because to me it seems
So in a sense that they're double. Yeah.
like a becoming sovereign, a fusion with God, or a king's two bodies scenario.
Well, there's no sovereign like that. I mean, it's not like that. It's not as if the body of the philosopher king is like the king's body in, say, medieval political theology. But there's a sense in which the philosopher is the only person that can rule justly because they know what justice is, or they know they can orientate their soul towards the good, and that's enough. Right?
It seems like the philosopher king might be the exception that gets to be the double role that enforces the single role on everyone else.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm happy to go with that. This is all with the huge caveat that Socrates is serious about what he's doing, right? We don't know. We don't know.
Right.
Again, as I said before this morning, the Straussian interpretation, and not just the Straussian interpretation, would claim that the irony at work here is exactly to show it's the inverse of what appears to be the case. This is an argument against the philosopher king. Let's go to book 10 and make a little progress there and then have a break. The first thing to ask about book 10 is why it's there at all. At the end of book 9, we get this is, the centrality of tragedy to the arguments of the Republic. The end of book 9, 568 A to D, is the conclusion of the discussion of tyranny, the last of the political forms that's under discussion. And Socrates insists on the link between tragedy and tyranny. Tragic poets make hymns to tyranny, he says. And the book ends. Then he says, book 10, something like, I paraphrase, he says, or maybe Glaucon says, there are many great things in our discussion. Socrates goes, yeah. The best of all was the discussion of poetry and the exclusion of the tragic poets. Yes, it was. Let's do it again. Okay. So they rehearse the argument. They do the same argument again. Why? The poets have been excluded from the city. So book 10, we have a return to the same argument and an extension of the range of the argument. It's not just about the education of the guardians, it's about, let's say, human beings as such, or something like that. That's far too general. So book 10 is a kind of appendix, but why does this appendix exist? What purpose does it serve, given that it only restates the arguments made earlier in the book? Well, the least that one might say is that it serves to underline the importance of those arguments. Right? The Republic concludes with a reiteration of the exclusion of the tragic poets. So it must have been a fairly important argument to be made. poetry, tragic poetry, is the opponent for Socrates. And Homer and the other great poets are the... I think you have to understand this historically. The trial and condemnation and execution of Socrates was an execution by poetry. Right? It was an execution by a regime that was legitimated through tragic poetry. This is Socrates' true apology, the Republic, where he responds to poetry with a dialogue of his own. And then finally with another poem, this myth to immortality at the end of it. So if Socrates is judged by poetry, his true apology in the Republic is to exclude, or if not execute, the tragic poets. Now, a couple of things to emphasize here. Homer is described early in Book 10 as the first teacher and leader of all tragic things. Right? Homer is the leader of the tragic poets. Fine tragic things. There's two phrases which reappear repeatedly. Fine tragic things and our fine regime. Right? It's clearly not a fine regime because Socrates has spent several books demolishing it and everything close to it. And then he does this extraordinary thing. He then says, let us proceed by our usual method. The word method in Greek means something like way. Right? Odos means way or path. Let's proceed by our usual method or procedure. And the usual method or procedure is to, for any set of particulars, for any set of what the Greeks called menes, we apply the same name. Right? So what's great about Book 10, if you get a chance to look at it, if you've already looked at it, you'll know what I'm talking about, is that we get one of the best descriptions of Socratic method, which is that for any number of particulars, we define those particulars in relationship to one. Right? The many and the one. Right? So if we have many chairs in the room, right, as we do, those chairs can all be explained through the form of a chair. Right? These particulars are explained with reference to a form. And indeed, the example that Socrates gives is the example from the artisanal world. The issue becomes one of beds or couches. And the argument here is very simple. What I'm trying to show now is that there are two. I've got this on the description, I think. Yeah. There are two arguments against tragedy, and they're linked. There's a metaphysical critique of tragedy, which I'm going to describe now, and then a moral critique of tragedy. And the two things are linked. But the metaphysical critique of tragedy is very simple. Right? We have the form of something, a bed. We have the phenomenon of something existing in the world, bed in the world, let's say form of bed. We have the bed in the world, let's say actual bed. And then we have the imitation of a bed. So we have three orders here. The order of the form, eidos in Greek, the order of phenomenon or appearance, and the order of imitation or mimesis. The argument that Socrates makes is that the mimetic artist the poet operates at this level, right? The level of mimesis. And all that the mimetic artist does is to imitate a phenomenon. Right? It is as if a man, it's the example that Socrates gives, took a huge mirror and walked around with a huge mirror saying, look, I'm making all sorts of things. Look at the reflections of the things I'm making. So he said, what would that be? And Glaucon says it would just be someone holding up a mirror and showing up reflections, imitations. He said, that's it. That's what the poet does. So poetry, tragic poetry, is the imitation of a phenomenon. If you're concerned with knowledge, you're concerned with the question of the form. Right? The question of eidos. The philosopher orientates their soul towards the form of the thing. And the form of the thing is what lies behind the appearance of the thing. So form, appearance, imitation. What does that produce? It produces what Heidegger will call, in his lectures on Nietzsche, a raging discordance between the order of art and the order of truth. Right? This is art. Hopeless with pens. Mr. Low Tech. The order of art, the order of truth. Right? So, if, let's say, for the tragic Greeks, we saw the statement from Gorgias this morning, right? That tragedy is a deception, where the deceiver is wiser than the undeceived. Okay, so tragedy is deception, but it's deception which leads to a form of wisdom and truth. What happens in Plato is the disruption of the order of art and truth, and the discordance between them, right? And this discordance is called metaphysics. It's called metaphysics. I mean, this is a very sort of Heideggerian interpretation of let's call it a Nietzschean interpretation. Nietzsche says somewhere that metaphysics is a division of one world into two. Right? And that turns around the question of art. Now, the work of the artist is therefore at a third remove from truth, a third remove from that which is. And the words are used interchangeably between being is at a third remove, right? 3, 2, 1. Third remove from the order of truth, or the being of that which is. And then, this is around 597e, if you want to follow this up. Once Socrates has got that metaphysical argument out, using the analogy of the craftsman, he says that's exactly how it is for the maker of tragedies. It's his first move. Right? The maker of tragedies is thrice removed from the throne of the king, he says. And this is true of all imitators. And at that point, Socrates says, in the way in which he often does, in the company of younger men, agreement has been reached, hasn't it? Yes, Socrates, of course. So much for dialogue. And then, like a cat returning to its vomit, Socrates turns back to tragedy once again, and to tragedy's chief, Homer, the so-called educator of the Greeks. And at this level, at this moment, the level of vitriol against Homer it's vituperative. The loathing you can feel for... and Homer will, Socrates will say things, well, I love poetry, it's great. I've loved it since I was a boy. But then again, I had no fucking choice, you know. It was shoved down my throat every day. Of course I love it, but it's false, you know. So, and he says, and this is amazing, he says, you know, what has Homer done? You know, it's like that moment in life of Brian. What have the Romans done for us? You know? Well, great road system, streets are safe at night. What's Homer done for us? What state has been reformed on the basis of his poetry? None. Nothing. Homer, Socrates concludes, had no practical skill. Right? Does Socrates have any practical skill? No, nothing. He just wanders around talking to people, you know, thinking, well, carpenters are pretty cool. You know, maybe one day I'll take that up. So there's extraordinary reflexivity here, again. And again, if we assume that Plato was stupid, then that's one thing. If we assume that he's not stupid, which I don't think he was, then we have to say that this level of reflexivity would have been clear to readers and listeners of this text. Homer is not a reliable teacher of the most important human things, and nor the tragic poets. But then again, nor is Socrates. We then reach the conclusion to this part of the argument, and this then turns to the moral issue, which for me is now, I think, more important. He says on 602b that the artist knows nothing, and the art of imitation has no serious value. It's a kind of play, particularly those who take up tragic poetry and who write poetry and write nice rhymes. That's the metaphysical critique. Now comes the moral critique. What is the moral critique? And here we have a distinction that we could line up with this if I wanted to use a separate page. To what part of the soul does imitation appeal? Socrates insists that imitation does not appeal to the superior part of the soul, what he calls the logistical part of the soul. It covers the rational or deliberative part of the soul. Imitation does not appeal to that. Imitative art appeals to the inferior part of the soul, the passionate part of the soul. Something like that. It's an argument here which I've sort of gone into. It's also interesting. He comes back to it again. He says something like, tragedy and poetry generally produces a war within the soul. It produces a war between competing factions, and the human being does battle with himself. We become a double man, right? And that has to be avoided. Philosophy, and I think this is terribly important, philosophy in the person of Socrates, and arguably for most of its history, is committed to the idea of a non-contradictory life. Right? The idea of a life that's at one with itself. Right? Tragedy is not committed to such a belief, and the tragic hero is shown to be at odds with himself and at odds with the city of which he is the expression or symptom. Then we come to grief. Right? So sketch the beginning of the moral critique, we come to grief. This is where this links very closely to Judith Butler's approach. The decent man, Socrates says, will regulate his grief over a lost son moderate any public displays of pain and emotion, whatever he might feel privately. The tragic poet transgresses the proper limit between the public and the private. I might be desperately upset, grieving over the loss of my father or mother, but I do not show that in public. That's what it means to be a philosopher. Tragedy celebrates excessive grief and excessive lamentation. This never gets anybody anywhere, Socrates says, around 604. What has to be cultivated is the capacity of deliberation. And the capacity of deliberation is subject to the activity of reason, logos. Which is, this argument is still everywhere, right? This is Habermas's argument in his entire theoretical edifice. Noble as it is, I'm not anti-Habermasian. Well, it depends which day it is. But, in Habermas, public discussion has to be governed by rationality, and rationality derives from what he calls the discourse principle. Right? Discourse principle is like a principle of logos. It's not metaphysical in Habermas, but this is what we expect. This is the governance of the public realm by something like philosophy. Tragedy messes with that. He says, we should not behave like children. We should not spend our time falling down and crying out the way children do. We must set to work to cure our souls as quickly as possible and set things right and do away with lament. Do away with lament. Right? It's like George Bush 11 days after 9/11 where he says, the time of mourning is past. Let's kick some ass. That's quite enough mourning. 11 days, let's go and do something. It's not quite, I'm not comparing Socrates with it's an interesting comparison. Now, idea, so you see the way what's happened in Book 10, this is the answer to why there is Book 10, is the argument for the education of guardians, how we rear young men to be philosophers and govern the city, has shifted into a wider argument about what it means to be a moral human being. And what Socrates is valorizing is the quiet, prudent man. The quiet, prudent man that keeps his emotions to himself and acts in the public realm with decorum, and is not drawn to excess. And Socrates says, this would never make good theatre. Right? This is lousy theatre. Theatre is driven by excessive emotion. Right? So we're never going to get, as it were, theatre pieces about quiet, prudent men. Clearly he hadn't anticipated Jimmy Stewart, but it's a thought. But theatre encourages excessive lament and discourages moral calculation. I've got some nasty things here. I don't know if I want to read them out. There's a cold, obsessional core at the heart of the philosophical personality in Socrates. A restraint. In a world governed by chance and randomness, stay calm, stay focused, think through your options rationally, and if you're going to weep, be sure to weep at home. Right? This is almost like advice for managers now. Right? Can you imagine a Socratic textbook? And the world for Socrates is clearly a random place, right? Governed by iniquitous regimes and people who are doing all sorts of weird things. The philosopher has to stay focused. This is what leads, by a circuitous route to that, to Stoicism. Right? Stoicism, which is the ideological complement of imperial rule. Right? It's not by chance that Seneca was the most powerful administrator in the Roman Empire and was also a Stoic philosopher, nor that Marcus Aurelius was too, right? Nor that at this moment in history, or perhaps in the last decade, Stoicism made a huge comeback, right? And why every airport you went to, you could pick up copies of Marcus Aurelius. It's partly the effect of Gladiator and all of that, but you could pick up Marcus Aurelius and you find out how to stay calm in a world of trouble. I don't want to get into Seneca. Seneca would be a whole bag of fish to get into. Very interesting though. Imitation is clearly not aimed at the superior part of the soul, but at the inferior part of the soul. The name for that is now revealed by Socrates as the alogistical, the alogistical, the irrational part of the soul. So imitation always imitates the inferior part of the soul because it is so extreme and moved to great sham fits of passion. I mean, I think that the effects of this argument are so profound, right? If we think about our implicit cultural responses to excessive lamentation. Right? We watch the Shia festivals, in honour of the Prophet Hussein, right? We watch people smeared with blood and screaming, and we think, what do we think? We become at that point, like Greeks, right? This is excessive lamentation. These people maybe should learn to control their emotions and button themselves up a little bit more. These attitudes are very, very pervasive, I think, that you find here in Plato. We have a problem with excessive lament. Right? And we've seen now, I was talking about that this morning, we've seen that week by week in the politicisation of funeral processions and all the rest in North Africa. Right? Maybe we're thinking about that in different ways now, I hope so. But anyway, moving, I'm almost done actually. Mimesis, imitation, causes us to be at odds with ourselves, at war with ourselves. It encourages the worst elements and denigrates the best. It introduces a bad regime into the soul. If the soul is at war with itself, the city is going to be at war with itself. If the soul is at peace with itself, the city might be at peace with itself. The founding analogy of Plato is the analogy between the soul and the city. Right? The structure of the city and the structure of the soul are the same structure. And philosophy must govern both. And then we move on 605c to the final exclusion of the tragic poets. And the final exclusion of the tragic poets is that Socrates acknowledges that even he is moved by Homer and the tragic poets. Even he is moved by them. And he gives into it. But we have to refuse that. What does imitation do? Imitation as tragic poetry do? It does at least two things. And these things are going to repeat in different aspects of the last few millennia. It threatens the distinction between the public and the private. Right? The private, our emotional life, becomes public. Lamentation, which you might feel, becomes a political matter. Grief and grievability becomes a political matter. That's a problem. Secondly, it threatens the economy of sexual difference that organises political life. Men become womanish and effeminate if they lament too excessively. Right? And just as a complement to that, if you read Rousseau, the letter to D'Alembert, where, down the road in Geneva, in 1758, Rousseau's nemesis Voltaire moved into the neighbourhood and thought, I'll open a theatre. Rousseau got wind of this and wrote a letter to D'Alembert against the opening of a theatre in Geneva. The argument against the theatre was a Platonic argument, but it really turned on those 2 points. If we allow theatre, there'll be a destabilisation of the public and the private, and most importantly, a destabilisation of the economy of sexual difference. Men and women will no longer know what to do. And that's catastrophe, politically, for Rousseau. Right? It's interesting. So, tragic mimesis disrupts the economy of pity that should regulate the behaviour of decent people, decent men, decent women, and the same is true of laughter. I could go into that, but I won't go into that. There's an argument here about laughter, how you should laugh, which again picks up on book 3. So, this is the argument's conclusion. He says, so when, Glaucon, he's talking to Glaucon, Plato's brother, when you meet praises of Homer and praises of the tragic poets, and people say Homer was the poet who educated Greece, you must love and embrace such people as being the best men there can be, and agree that Homer is the most poetic and first of all the tragic poets. Right? So someone comes to our city and says, Homer's terrific, is it brilliant? You say, yeah, wonderful, give him a big hug, one first of all poets, and you're polite, you honour them with hospitality, and then you tell them that only hymns to the gods and paeans to great men should be admitted into our city, and reluctantly you're going to have to leave. Because if you come into our city will be governed by pleasure and pain and not by reason and law. And that's why we have to exclude the poets, the tragic poets, from the philosophically well-ordered city. And then he says, well, but if that sounds too harsh, if that sounds too rustic, he says, the word here, rustic, tell them this. And again, how are we meant to interpret this? He says, tell them this. Tell them there's an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Right? There's an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Really fantastic. And but the argument's a hypothetical one. It's often framed as if it were a direct statement, and it's not. And if you're inclined to use this ancient quarrel argument, say to these people that if the poets could make a defense of poetry in prose, then they can come back in. Okay? But the way it's poised in the Republic, it's as if Socrates doesn't believe a word of this. Okay? This is a hypothetical, just in case this objection comes up. If poetry can make an apology, then we can let it back in. Poetry is a childish love which has to be given up. And the contest here is great, greater than it seems, Plato says. Philosophers must not be tempted by money, honour, or public office, but most of all, they mustn't be tempted by poetry into neglecting justice and the life of virtue. No? So, the conclusion to this is that we get the strong sense from Socrates as poetry as entirely seductive. Tragedy is an entirely seductive activity that draws the soul out of itself into identification with the sufferings of others. We have to refuse that seduction and maintain self-control. And he says to Glaucon, if you begin to waver, then cite this argument as a counter-charm. Just keep rehearsing this argument in your head until the temptation is past, and then you'll be okay. Which gives you an idea of maybe how Platonic arguments are meant to be used, right? You're meant to memorize them and then rehearse them in your mind in order to prevent you from taking a certain course of action. And then, if things weren't weird enough already, we then shift immediately in the space of, say, 3 or 4 lines from a discussion of poetry into the argument for the immortality of the soul. And it's completely unclear how this stacks up. The myth of transmigration of the souls, and all the rest. And then the book finishes. Different theories about how we might conceive of that, but let's just say that. So it's as if, having excluded poetry, the Republic ends with this myth of the myth of the transmigration of souls, which is a poetic myth. Conclusion. Conclusion. A rather general conclusion. Philosophy is the dramatic staging of an argument for the implementation of a regime into the soul and the city whose core is the control of excessive affect, excessive emotion. In particular, the extremes of pity and terror, but also ridicule and irony. We haven't gone into that argument. There's a whole separate argument about the dangers of ridicule, the dangers of irony in comedy. So to be a philosopher is to control excessive affect. Philosophy is affect regulation on this picture. To be a philosopher is to control the excess of imitation and the threat of emotional ecstasis that it enacts. This surfeit of emotion risks leading the soul into contradiction with itself, and risks effeminizing the city and plunging it into democracy firstly and tyranny secondly. Tyranny is the continuation, the truth of democracy on this picture. By making public what should be private, tragedy disrupts the psychic economy of the city, and this is why it must be expelled. So if philosophy as a practice is a form of rational affect regulation and resistance to forms of theatrical spectacle, let me put this, a hypothetical. If philosophy is a practice of rational affect regulation and the resistance to forms of theatrical spectacle that we find in democracy and tyranny, then we have a question. And the question is, I want to pick up after the break, let's have a little discussion first if you like. The question is, what on earth is Aristotle doing in the Poetics? Is the Poetics the kind of apology for poetry in prose that Socrates calls for in Book 10? This is often how the book has been read. And it's not wrong. But it might not be the whole story. And everything hangs here on how we understand a concept that's just dropped into chapter 6 of the Poetics. And that concept is catharsis. Right? Key concept in Aristotle. It's never defined. Right? It's used infrequently in Aristotle. It's used in a way which leads one to believe that he assumed that people knew what it meant. We'll go into Aristotle a little bit after the break, but why is that the issue? Aristotle is depends how you read him, but on a certain view. As much of a commitment to reason as Plato. It's very differently conceived. But the danger of tragic poetry for Plato is clear. It corrupts the soul. It produces contradiction in us, and war in us and war in the city. The way Aristotle's going to get around this problem is by saying that what tragedy does is it produces a kind of catharsis. Right? What's that catharsis? It can be understood in two ways. It can be understood as a kind of emotional laxative, right? Which is often how it's understood. So catharsis is like forms of physical relief. Right? So, you could say, I was stressed out and tense all day, and then I had a couple of beers and found this joke really funny. It's relief, laxative, right? There's that sense of catharsis, just letting go. You finally can, and that's not wrong. That meaning is there. But the other side to the meaning of catharsis is something perhaps more interesting and something closer to how it's picked up in, say, psychoanalysis, which would be what Freud calls sublimation. And which we can define sublimation as the transformation of passion, the transformation of affect into something else. So, what does that all mean? Well, Plato's view seems fairly clear, at least on a surface reading of the text. Tragedy cannot be admitted into the city. Aristotle's view would seem to be the contrary, but that depends on how the emotions unleashed in tragedy are to be transformed and utilised and mobilised.